أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Dearest listeners, brothers, sisters, believers, knowledge seekers, God seekers. I don't know how many different kind of titles we've got together for each other, but Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. And thank you for coming back. Thank you for returning. And as I said in the beginning of the last one, I really hope that you are enjoying this journey. Last time obviously we concluded on Tawheed, or at least our very, very introductory understanding of Tawheed, and I kind of just hope that it's opened up a few more dimensions to the way that you see life. I love using the example of, when you go to the optician, and for those of you who haven't been for a long time, I recommend it. You've gone to the optician and they tweak your prescription a little bit, and in theory, you actually see better now with this new prescription, with this new set of glasses that you've put on. You see things differently. But initially, when you come out of the shop, and even especially with contact lenses, they're like, it may feel a little bit weird. You may not be used to it. The prescription may give you a bit of a headache, but trust me, you're seeing things more clearly. I think in a similar way, if we've managed to jump over that fence from seeing God as limited to now seeing him as unlimited and indescribable, so on and so forth, it may just still be like playing with our heads a little bit, and we may be struggling to see things incredibly clearly, but in the back of our heads actually we're starting to understand things more clearly, and eventually over time we'll be able to see it more clearly. So I hope that journey through Tawheed, a very, very basic one, has been beneficial, and inshallah it sets the platform now to go on to the concept of Adalat, the justice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So as I mentioned last time, we're doing roughly 2 of Ayatollah Naser's lectures per podcast session. We're trying to condense it a little bit, so definitely go back and read the book. It's like 2-3 pages per lecture, super short, and if you would like to have some more advanced reading around this, don't hesitate to just give me a shout, and I can suggest some other material to you. So let's jump into it, right? Justice, Adalat. What is this all about? We know it's an usul. We know that when we get taught Tawheed, Adalat, Nubuwwah, Imamah, Qiyamah, we know that it's an usul. But we want to try and understand why is it an usul. And we'll try and look at this from 2 fronts. Firstly, why is it chosen as one of God's most significant attributes? I.e., given that God is great and he's merciful, he's loving, he's forgiving, he's generous. There's so many different traits that we could actually pick from that would fit, that could have been in the usul. Yet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his divine wisdom selects Adalat to be the second of our usul rather than those other items. And why is that? Why is that the case? And why was it this attribute in particular that stands out? So in order to do that, what we're going to try and get through in this session today, which is going to be maybe a little bit longer, but I'm going to try and go a bit quick, and we are going to miss out some material, so do definitely go back to the book. But we'll try and look at what is justice. We're going to try and define it, understand it, and also look at the inverse of it. What is injustice? What is the actual difference between the two? We're also going to compare justice versus equality, because especially in today's day and age, you may have noticed everyone wants to be equal. Everything is meant to be equal, and that is the human's limited understanding of what they think to be justice is fairness. But actually justice is very different to equality, and we'll discuss that a little bit. We'll then look at the source of injustice. Where does it come from? What brings it about? And then try and understand, so where does God fit into this picture of justice, injustice, equality, so on and so forth. And inshallah that will be hopefully where we end up today if we manage to get through it all in time, because there's a lot to go through. So in terms of the why is Adalat picked as one of the usul of Allah, of this faith, and also one of the titles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Why is it this one in particular? And actually what we learn is that the Adalat, this justice, has such a significant position in our faith. And that is because most of God's attributes actually relate back to it. Because justice in its widest meaning is to put every item in its proper position. So what do I mean by that? And actually one of our teachers explained this beautifully. He said, take a book, for example. If you see a book and there's a bookshelf or there's the floor, If you put the book on the bookshelf, you've put it in its rightful place. You've put it in its proper position. Whereas if you put that book on the floor, then you've done zulm on it. Zulm, oppression, but oppression is actually putting something out of its proper position. So justice in its widest meaning is to put that book on the shelf. It's to put every item in its proper position. And the most merciful and the sustainer and the sage and the forgiver, all of these titles have their roots in justice. Those qualities are leveraged and putting things in their rightful place. And in addition, we actually see that the other usul, namely nubuwah, imamah and qiyamah, all depend on justice. So inshallah, after these 5 sessions on Adalat, and we'll move on to nubuwah if Allah gives us the rizq and the tawfiq, we'll see that the understanding of prophethood premises itself on Adalat. So this is just a few reasons on why Adalat is so important. Something that we will just quickly mention, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, is that there is a difference of opinion and belief system within a few schools within the fold of Islam. For example, the Ash'arites from the Ahlus Sunnah actually deny God's justice entirely, that they claim that the issue of God's justice is actually irrelevant and that all existence is in his possession and belongs to him. So they don't believe in the concept of rational goodness and unseemliness and a lack of grace. They don't think that we, with our wisdom and our intellect, can actually distinguish between what is justice and what isn't justice, or what is good or bad on its own. Whereas you have the Mu'tazilites and the Shia who do believe in God's Adalah, because we fundamentally believe that God never engages in injustice and tyranny, and therefore because we're able to claim that, we're able to decipher between what is goodness and what is unseemliness. We believe that we can actually differentiate that to a decent degree, not completely, but to a decent degree. And therefore the Shi'as go on to use imamah, as I've just said, as an usul. We go on to use imamah as an usul because it's premised on Adalah, and you'll see that link come about quite regularly. But we don't want to spend too much time on that, but we will point back to that difference, and it may help you understand why some schools of thought don't take on the concept of imamah. It's very closely linked to Adalah. So let's try and understand this Adalah in a little bit more detail and how this actually relates to the other usul. You see, religion's secondary principles are always a reflection on the fundamental principles. And what we see is that Adalah is a fundamental principle. It has a tremendous effect on human society. By adopting Adalah as a fundamental principle of our faith, it is a means of reviving justice in human societies and encouraging the struggle against any kind of injustice and aggression. And you see this repeatedly mentioned, for example, in the revolution of not just Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, but also the anticipated revolution of our awaited Saviour, Al-Qa'im min Ali Muhammad, Ajjalallahu ta'ala Farj al-Sharif. The leadership of the prophets and the Imam alayhi salam actually sets the stage for true leadership in human societies, to create a society that is equitable, that is justice, that is fair. Thus, Adalah, which governs all of human societies, putting everything in its rightful place. Everything within society should go in a rightful place. There is a role, responsibility, set of laws for every item of creation. When all of that is put in its perfect place, then we have achieved this perfect situation of justice. And it's an indication of the need for justice in human civilization. We all want it. We all want to reach this perfect system where everyone can flourish and reach their potential. And the great world of creation is based on justice, and so is human society, because we're obviously also part of human creation. So, as we mentioned earlier, this definition of justice is around putting everything into its proper position. It's to be in equilibrium. This is a very wide understanding of the term. It's applicable right the way from the great and massive galaxies through to the minuscule atoms and electrons and so on, to the human body, to plants, to organisms. There is this adalah, this justice of Allah creating everything in a way such that it works. It's all in its rightful position. The heart is placed in a specific place within the human body in order to make sure that we can pump the correct amount of blood around our body. And if any of these forces in the world were to fall out of tune, or if that heart were to be in a different position, we wouldn't be in equilibrium. Something would go wrong because that thing wasn't placed in its rightful place. For example, plants getting water, this is justice because a plant needs this water in order to fulfill its potential. In the same way, or in the opposite way I should say, humans being submerged into water would be injustice because we're not designed to live underwater, unless maybe you're like Michael Phelps or some of those guys. But if water is used for the plants, justice rules. If water is used for drowning humans, injustice rules. So you can start to see that things need to be in their rightful place. Not everything or everyone should have the same thing, which is what you see trying to be championed today of this concept of equality, which is a nice concept, but I think ill thought out. Water is perfect for plants, but it's not perfect for humans. Everything has its rightful place and context. The other meaning of justice is where we consider other people's rights, i.e. it's unjust to deprive others of their rights or to engage in discrimination or favoritism based on race, on ethnicity, on wealth class, etc. And justice in both meanings applies to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in putting everything in its proper position and also in considering other people's rights. However, the second meaning is more the one that is intended when we discuss this adalat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the implication is this: God doesn't deprive anybody of their rights or anything of their rights, nor does he engage in any favoritism. There is zero discrimination when it comes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is truly just. And in the future, inshallah, in upcoming sessions, we'll look at proofs in more detail. And just to firm this understanding of this topic of adalah before we go further with it, let's quickly reflect on injustice, right? So whether it means the deprivation of rights or engaging in favoritism or discrimination, this is simply not in harmony with God's attributes. God will never punish a righteous person. Neither does he encourage a wrongdoer in his vicious acts. He doesn't punish anyone for the wrong actions committed by others. Actions are based on complete justice. Therefore, Allah uses justice with all members of society under all circumstances. So when we look back to that Asharite claim where they said, no, we cannot differentiate between goodness and unseemliness, it's actually false. Because when they declare that God is just, even if he were to, for example, send all the prophets to hell, or even if he dispatched all the wrongdoers and criminals to paradise, they would say, no, we can't decipher between this. But no, we say, actually, with something like that, we can very clearly see adalah and the lack of adalah, justice and injustice. As humans, we can interpret a decent amount, not everything, and see what is justice and what isn't justice. So when the Asharites say, no, we can't differentiate it, we would say, well, if the prophet were to be sent to hell, this would be injustice. So actually, the concept of justice exists, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is just, because there is a huge difference between justice and injustice. Common sense just doesn't utter such nonsense to suggest that, we can't decipher between it. And now we're going to look at a different angle. And again, this is a bit of an intro, so I'm going to be reading off a few different concepts, and usually I'll take a little bit more time, but I've been told with the feedback that you guys are sharing with me, and please do continue to share it, that you like it to be quite concise, like 15, some of you have said minutes, others have said 20. I'm doing my best to try and keep it as concise as I can. But another angle that I now want to kind of explore, Ayatollah Naser takes us on a journey on, is to look and reflect briefly over this difference between justice and equality, because there is a really important difference, and unfortunately it is being incorrectly interchanged between the two terms quite a lot, and they are not the same. And let's explain this, right? Equality is not a precondition for justice to occur. And I'll rephrase that. You do not need equality in order for justice to occur. Why? Well, very simply, priorities and preferences should be considered. Let's use an example. It wouldn't be just, or let's make this simpler, it would be unjust if you gave every student in a class the same grade. That'd be really unfair. Why? Because neither two students should receive the same grade, for example. In the same way, in the workplace, two workers shouldn't necessarily receive the same wage. In the context of a classroom, if one of them is more competent in the field that they're being assessed on, then they should be rewarded accordingly, right? With a higher grade. That would be justice. Injustice or equality would say, no, give them both the same thing. But that's not right. One achieved in 90%, the other achieved 30%. So why would we give them both the same grade? Similarly, someone who is doing very complicated work in the workplace versus someone who is maybe very, very junior in their journey in the workplace, they shouldn't receive the same wage, right? Equality doesn't work. It doesn't contribute to justice. Priorities and preferences should be considered. Justice is used when a student receives the grade according to their merit, and a worker receives their wage based on their expertise and experience. And the same is for nature. It wouldn't be justice for a whale, a massive whale in the sea, to have the same sized heart as a little robin or a little squirrel or an ant, or a tree, a massive oak tree, to have the same size roots of a tiny daffodil. Which would make sense. It would be equality, but it wouldn't be just. It wouldn't be right. You haven't put something in its rightful place. It is just. It is adalat for any organism to receive subsistence in accordance with its merits and capabilities, based on what it needs in order to achieve its true potential. So I hope that as a general introduction has made sense. And I think actually we're going to pause it there, because I think that's a lot to chew on. We're going to see if we can make these a little bit more concise. And then inshallah in the next session, we're going to go on to the reasons for Allah's justice. We're going to try and understand this in a little bit more detail. But inshallah from this session, you've kind of had a quick whistle stop, there we go, introduction into Adalat, into God's justice, and how this isn't the same as equality, and how justice differs to injustice, and how justice is putting things in its rightful place. And inshallah we'll end this session, and I hope you'll join us for the next, inshallah. Take care, and we'll see you next time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.